What if I told you there was supposed to be an Overwatch clone that actually managed to have a modicum level of success, despite being helmed by arguably one of the worst game developers, rated both by the community and, as of late, its own employees? You would probably not know what game I'm talking about, when most of the titles that competed with Overwatch, willingly or not, have failed, except the more recent super popular Marvel Rivals, which has a cast of most of the popular superheroes in it, but shares similar gameplay and modes to Overwatch. But before Marvel Rivals, and yes, actually before Overwatch, there was hi-rez the studio, and their history of working on games before quickly moving on to other ones, a little too quickly I might add for my taste. Hi-rez was cooking in the lab, when they ended up creating something that was similar in ways to Overwatch, but originally quite unique and novel of a game and concept. While Paladins would have its earliest development started much before its announcement in the 2010s, it wouldn't actually launch into open beta until September of 2016, and then launch fully in May of 2018. Paladins was able to reach 35 million players within just a few years, with peak players at a respectable 20,000 plus. This is not only impressive for the time, but it's impressive in modern times, with these numbers being half of what Overwatch 2 is capable of in current day. While some might scratch their head at that statement, Paladins has always been an underdog in their competition with other competitive shooters, both having a smaller budget/team and being led by a not-so-liked studio. Paladins would manage to have a 5+ year run before being recently announced in 2025 to be pushed into a maintenance mode after having most of their employees laid off or moved to other projects. This would effectively slowly kill the game as active development is halted altogether. The death of a game series is usually about highlighting major failures or deaths of companies or games, but sometimes we also chronicle middling titles or even extremely successful and genre-defining ones. That's because our ultimate goal is to cover all virtual worlds and all online gaming in general, whether they are the most popular major hits or the quiet cult classics. If there's a story to be told, we want to tell the story. Paladins falls into the latter. Sure, it's in maintenance mode now qualifying for the series, but it still managed to actually reach a good level of success, given the circumstances and their competition. That being said, Paladins never really reached their full potential, at least in my opinion, with many game-breaking and changing updates happening within the game's beta phase before it ever even launched. On top of this, Paladins has had to battle against other issues uphill that kept it from being even more competitive with Overwatch and the like. Pay attention as the video unfolds, as clues will pop up here and there as the timeline progresses until its termination. Once that happens, we will have a final deduction where we combine all of the clues and bits of evidence and crack the case. Without further ado, detectives, we have a case to carry on with, so choose and customize your champion and their cards, and let's complete the objectives. The story begins with the rumblings of a new project for hi-rez, following the inability to turn a profit on their more recent online sci-fi shooter of the time, Global Agenda. Hi-rez, being privately funded, needed to switch gears. While some of their team would move on to Tribes Ascend, before abandoning that at the first sight of trouble too, like they did with Global Agenda, not like I'm holding a grudge. Hi-rez! The remaining teams would work on Project Aurum, which was a fantasy-styled action shooter of sorts, and you can actually see some early footage of it here. Project Aurum would spawn Smite, and what would remain of the team would go on to form the basis of Paladins for hi-rez. The team tried a sci-fi approach originally to give some love to their Global Agenda roots, but would settle on a more fantasy theme ultimately. Overwatch. Yeah, it took me all of like one section in the main body of this video for me to mention it again. It's going to be a boogeyman, but I promise I'm only going to keep comparisons to the beginning of the video, as they have very similar timelines pre-launch and at launch. Paladins is historically seen and called an Overwatch clone, but according to leadership, Project Aurum was started back in 2012, and thus development for Paladins and Overwatch was actually rather similar. Well, if you just count Overwatch itself, which doesn't make sense because when hi-rez Todd Harris talks about it, the co-founder and main director of the game, he states that Paladins came first because of Project Aurum. You can just merely reply or state that, but Overwatch started with Project Titan, which was like pre-2010. Anyway, the comments will be filled with this kind of like comment, but let's get it out of the way. Overwatch is an older game in idea, but Paladins gets unfairly maligned regarding being an Overwatch clone, in development at least. That's because at some point there was a patch and update that kind of made that worse. Overwatch would be officially announced publicly November 2014, and Activision Blizzard would spend the next year building up the hype for the game through the release of character trailers and lore packages. This would cast a shadow over the industry, with grand expectations now, well, expected, anime-level ones. I mean, these shorts were amazing. Paladins would be announced the following year, August 2015, and wouldn't have the same level of hype and marketing, and that could be seen and felt from the start. At this point, while many might assume, including those more savvy with business, that hi-rez should just assume the business corporate decision of being the second or the third best, which still pays extremely well. But Paladins was actually still on its own path largely at this point, and was working towards its own unique identity. Overwatch would be the first to reach a publicly playable state in the form of a limited closed beta test in October of 2015, and Paladins would shortly follow, releasing in November of 2015 in closed beta as well. This time, hi-rez had managed to keep things as close as possible, and the runoff would surely help Paladins, especially with the differences between the games potentially. I was lucky enough to test both of these games in their closed beta, and they really did feel like distinguished and different games. Yes, Overwatch was a hero shooter with objective-based modes, and Paladins was that too, but it wasn't just that. It actually had a massive open map instead of like a smaller shooter-centric map that allowed for all kinds of plays and discovery. And even though it was a big map, the matches would still only last around 15 minutes to like 30, and you could ride around during the spawn or outside of combat in general with the help of a mount. As you would progress in levels, you would be given new choices and selections of cards that would empower you in your abilities, allowing for more deep customization and replayability. The card system in Paladins is actually one of the most unique aspects of the game, allowing you to choose from a group of them pre-match, called a loadout, and then during the match, which is kind of like leveling up and picking talents, as well as purchase from a selection of generic ones, sort of like items in a MOBA. The process, or flow of a match, was built around the objective focus of the game mode Siege, and how players in it must rush to capture a point, then defend it as the map progresses. You then had to push your payload essentially, kind of like push in Overwatch, more so than just the payload map, where both teams could push to the other side, progressing the game. Time to kill in Paladins is another one of the unique aspects of the game, not just due to how the card system functioned, but also due to simply how much slower it was to kill a player, versus in something like Overwatch or Battleborn even. This allowed less shooter-centric players to have more of a chance, and even MMO players finding a bit of a home with Paladins. Meanwhile, a failed hero shooter and Lawbreakers tried the opposite, including not being free to play. I know that seems like a stray, but I felt like it was relevant. Regarding Paladins being free to play, hi-rez would state that they had learned their lesson from Smite, which recently was making some moves and money largely through their skin sales, aka microtransactions, since the game was actually free. And thus Paladins was shifting to a similar model, also cleverly positioning it as a free alternative to Overwatch. Overwatch would launch in May of 2016 and would change the very face of gaming, especially the shooter world. While this sounds like an exaggeration, not only would Overwatch reach 7 million players in the first week, Blizzard would also report over $1 billion in revenue the first year. Overwatch was a near full-priced multiplayer game with no single player, and thus the player number that you hear is paid players. Overwatch would make even existing franchises start adopting characters and heroes and ultimate abilities and the like, much like MOBAs made other games do before, including hero shooters. But although the Paladins, the Overwatch clone comments get old, what people, including the co-founder of hi-rez, Todd, failed to grasp is that Paladins might not have been made with the idea to copy Overwatch, but it was a unique game. But a major change would happen in closed beta following the incredible success of Overwatch, I might add, August of 2016, with their CB30 patch, which would essentially turn Paladins into Overwatch. This is impossible not to notice, whether from afar or even as a player. Not only would things like the UI and the entire mounting system, which was now automated, and the card system even be changed, things that people didn't even want changed really, they also would change core features, like the time to kill, which was also much faster. You also now had ultimate abilities, a UI that mimicked Overwatch, and it was like instead of differentiating from it, when they already had success doing that, hi-rez ran towards the comparisons. So you can't really be mad when they arrive, no? Paladins would enter its open beta, but more like its early access launch, as typical with hi-rez games, so they can monetize it as fast as possible due to self-publishing. The new changes were now present, and regardless of these changes, Paladins would explode into top Steam charts, reaching 100,000 new accounts created in just one day as well. While Paladins would lack the polish that Blizzard games were kind of famous for, it was still quite polished as a title, with no FPS dropping and good visuals. While some were flocking to the game because of its ability to borrow from other successful games, the majority of the reviews that you would read on Steam during this period of time showcased that Paladins' biggest strength was being the free alternative to Overwatch. Not necessarily being the copy to it though. And it was free to play. which should be stated that, as I tend to always say in videos like this, that free-to-play is an oxymoron. It's free to try more like, but there's always a couple of things that you have to buy, and things that end up making it either pay to win, or a bunch of vanity and collection stuff that kind of are just cool to have. Now, Paladins wouldn't have any pay-to-win aspects in it, luckily, but still it rubbed many the wrong way, including myself, that they were already charging people for things in a supposed open beta. While Overwatch would hit multiple millions of players in the first week, Paladins, a game built by barely a team of originally like a dozen or so developers, would take a few months but would hit similar numbers. This was a major success to me, though it should be stated that Overwatch's players were paying $40 for the game, while Paladins wasn't able to make that level of money without their microtransactions, which Overwatch would also have. Still, it's safe to say that Paladins at this point was the de facto number 2 dog, at 60,000 peak players on Steam, which was a nice place to be when many titles were coming out and floundering spectacularly. Paladins would also launch on consoles into early access into the following year, further boosting its population and reach. Paladins would even manage, though a few years later, crossplay, something that Overwatch would actually take a little bit longer to achieve. By the end of 2017, Paladins had reached a total of 5 million players and still had an active player count on Steam. However, the most controversial patch yet would happen December 18th, 2017, and yeah, arguably more controversial than the Overwatchification update. OB64 would, not unlike the Overwatch update, change the foundation of Paladins, this time regarding the monetization. Now cards would only be able to be leveled up by opening chests, and you had to get the same card multiple times in order to level it up. Now cards also couldn't be chosen for a loadout pregame, and you could level up the cards to as much as like level 10. So holding 5 cards against a player who didn't level them up would put you at like a 50 level advantage over somebody. This is even worse because now the game is kind of pay to win, because your character is more powerful with more powerful traits. Now, I don't know if these changes came because hi-rez was looking for a way to make more money, or simply felt that they didn't want to keep being second best if they weren't going to get paid accordingly, if you catch my drift. Luckily, the update, though, would only last a few patches before being removed, but the damage was kind of already done, with the peak population dropping to like 34,000 players around this point. And worse, the reputation of Paladins and hi-rez, further I should add, being tarnished. This would keep players from playing Paladins because they weren't sure that they even reverted these changes in the first place, as some of my sources would even state. Coming as a bit of an oddball move, detectives, in attempting to cash in on the current trend of battle royale games as typical with hi-rez and, no, not just the Paladins accusations, check out this. Paladins would launch a spin-off mode dubbed Paladins Battlegrounds. Paladins Battlegrounds would feature hero shooter battle royale gameplay with up to 100 players on a giant map. And to put it simply, and not spend too much time explaining what Paladins Battlegrounds was, or what it would later become known as, Realm Royale, because we've actually already covered it on the series, Realm Royale was a battle royale hero shooter that was fantasy focused. Realm Royale would launch later in the year, in the summer, and would feature a different style and gameplay compared to the mode featured in Paladins. Now, this shift wasn't just a change of a name, it literally became a Fortnite clone overnight. I mean, you can even see it in the video gameplay. While it might seem like I'm just picking at hairs here, I think hi-rez was already showing a desire to pivot to something else, bigger and better. A habit that they would showcase throughout nearly all of their titles, especially the more recent ones. hi-rez chasing trends as a company wasn't inherently bad, it's kind of smart. It just seemed like they would get bored of their new toy eventually though, and move on to the next shiny one. And Realm Royale was just another example of this, especially when it was recently officially cancelled after existing in a maintenance mode for some time quietly, with no communication concerning such. The full launch of Paladins would happen May 8th, 2018, roughly 2 years after it entered its supposed open beta, closer to an early access launch. This time, although the review ratio was technically more positive, far fewer players would join the game during this time compared to their open beta launch. My guess is that people already thought that the game was out, so launching it didn't really do much to push things. Another issue could be the combination of now having a lack of identity, being the Overwatch clone, and proper marketing. Had Paladins been more unique like it was pre-launch, they could have marketed themselves on that fact and thus differentiated without having to put that much money into it. Instead, now you have an Overwatch clone in many respects without any of the marketing that that game is famous for and capable of. Just watch the launch trailers and compare them. One feels like a movie, the other feels like a Fiverr cinematic. Paladins would drop a mobile game sometime during the same month, very fitting, which would be eventually canned after next to no hoopla for it. Reportedly, Paladins Strike as it was dubbed was made by Goblin Network, a company who no longer exists, a Chinese company that hi-rez seemed to just kind of offload their development to, contracting-wise, and the results were just about as expected. Diablo Immortal, except way worse. With population data at under 30,000 peak players and under 15,000 concurrent for the first time, Paladins was already showing signs of slowing down the same year that it launched. Sure, the game was able to hit 35 million players in total, reportedly, but things weren't peachy keen at hi-rez, their parent company. hi-rez would split into 3 studios following major news dropping in August of 2018. This was done in a way to focus development on specific projects reportedly, and have studios assigned to specific games most likely. Though I also have to be honest, I think it's a tactic that studios like Wildcard behind Ark Survival use to shed their negative stigmas associated with their name. Evil Mojo Studios was put in charge of running Paladins. Something I found interesting when trying to find out more about the team behind Paladins, aka pre-Evil Mojo and post-Evil Mojo. And to be honest, it's really difficult, detectives. The team is very small, and very likely always has been, likely contributing to why it seemed a bit outmatched not just budget-wise, but content-wise compared to Overwatch. But worse, to me at least, was that it seemed like those working on Paladins in general, besides a few key figures like the art director and a couple leaders, were rather inexperienced. And I would argue even like a junior level team. Mind you, sometimes credits aren't accurate online, and maybe some of these developers disappeared into the ethos, but I think that it's actually indicative of why Paladins never felt like it had its own full identity, because it never really had its own full team. That just screams we made, or at least changed this game to keep up with the trends, and also showcases a historical inability for hi-rez as a company to maintain their talent when they would have them. hi-rez wasn't going to be able to compete with Overwatch and other live service shooters with such infrequent updates too. I feel 2019 was the year that this really changed for Paladins. We actually would see a number of named and advertised, partly, updates, starting with the Pirate's Treasure update in September of 2019. The problem is this is like the worst update of the year, because it's a classic live service monetization update, where it's just a battle pass and new skins that you can buy. The Damned Frontier, as it was dubbed, would add a new champion, Rom, whom I'm actually quite fond of because he looks and plays like a Doom character. And Paladins would then introduce 2 new siege maps during this time, Shattered Desert and Bazaar. Bazaar's introduction is one of the coolest. It has a really cool soundtrack and honestly shows probably some of the most personality for a map in the game. Tigrin's Tail, which would be the last update of the year, would drop December 2019 and would release another champion, this time Tiberius, the Weapon Master. 2 more updates would happen at the start of 2020, and these were kind of more of the same live service slop monetization updates. There's a couple of aspects that are strange about this though. For starters, Paladins isn't published by a big corporation. They're self-published, meaning that hi-rez was doing this themselves. As a private company, not a corporation, they were purposely mimicking corporate gaming's approach as a private company. Ew. The other aspects I dislike, and this is true for all live service games, is that developers are just sitting on the content, your maps, your champions, your new things, you name it. They're just sitting on all of it with the intention to breadcrumb it to release it. This isn't the same as designing it and then launching whenever ready. No, it's more calculated and kind of sleazy. It's the calculation, because the calculation is just about making more money. These paltry updates might be historically blamed on COVID, but that happened during the last update of the year. After reaching an impressive 45 million players now, Paladins alongside other multiplayer titles would release fewer updates in 2020 to coordinate with the pandemic and all. However, many other shooters, even classic ones, were growing in population size during this time. Meanwhile, Paladins' player base was shrinking by the end of 2020, down to just 14,000 players peak and under 10,000 players concurrently. hi-rez, recognizing how slow the update cycle was going for their past year, would promise with their Eternal Pyre update and subsequent ones that the new update cycle would be more frequent. The major update being Season 4 Calamity, which would drop February 3rd, 2021. Not only would it introduce a new hero in the form of Yagoroth the Devourer, it would add some new ranked rewards as well. But the promised more frequent changes came, but the updates weren't really anything to write home about. They were not really even filled with much content, to be frank. Each update would add a new champion just about, but not really a whole lot of anything else. And I know we hate Overwatch comparisons, damn it, but Overwatch had more content and a seasonal Christmas patch than Paladins had in like full season launches. I know Paladins was supposed to be the free alternative, but it felt more like the free indie alternative. Imagine if they had bigger budgets, a bigger team, and a proper support system. They would have likely left Overwatch's shadow a bit more and found more success. Population by the end of 2021 was down to just 13,000 peak players and 7,500 concurrent. These were numbers getting dangerously close to a population size that would struggle to find accurately matched games, which would just exacerbate issues. Season 5 would drop January 31st, 2022, and although it would, like the previous 8 updates, just release one champion and a few balance changes, the update, dubbed Schism, just feels so uninspired. They dubbed their battle pass this time around the Abyss Hunter Academy, which kind of sounds cool. It sounds like something Monster Hunter-esque, or like My Hero Academia. The problem being that that's the extent of the coolness of the update. Where are the proper challenges? Where's the lore and the thought? Why not introduce a new player academy that allows old players to master new challenges, or do something corny with each other? When you're just releasing a new battle pass after new battle pass after new battle pass with no new gameplay, it just feels like business updates, more than game updates. Hi-rez would restructure, yet again, this time more officially I guess, and Evil Mojo would still handle Paladins, but would also now handle Realm Royale and Rogue Company, the latter two described as being in maintenance mode. Evil Mojo was split extremely thinly at this point, having to run maintenance on 2 different games and live development on another. With the restructuring would also come a number of undisclosed layoffs. Hi-rez wasn't sitting as pretty as they were before, with Smite fading away in relevance and revenue generation, and their resources being spent on developing its sequel. Following the news and subsequent smaller updates, the population would continue to drop. By the summer of 2024, hitting as low as 5,500 players peak and just 3,400 players concurrent. Something we avoided mentioning due to how many times we have already mentioned it was Overwatch. It actually released a sequel in 2022, meaning that they were getting newer and fancier content, meanwhile Paladins was heavily stagnating. And yes, Overwatch 2 was mostly hated, but it still was overall more success for Overwatch. The Paladins team would add custom games that would actually become quite popular during this time, allowing players to customize just about everything about the game. However, the updates from the end of 2023 to the end of 2024 were all small updates, some not even adding any new champions or maps at all. And just when you thought that Paladins would get a slow but respectable death, Marvel Rivals would pop out of nowhere and just start knocking everyone out, surprising everyone with their smash launch on December 6th, 2024. Marvel Rivals would reportedly make overall 150 million their first month, and be downloaded by 20 million players in just the first few months. This level of success was insane, especially with so many hero shooters still on the market, but Overwatch and Paladins had been slowly fading away. Paladins more so, and Marvel Rivals had just poured gasoline on all of that. During this time, Paladins would drop to a mere 4,600 players peak and 2,100 players concurrent. Smite 2 would launch for Hi-rez at the end of 2024 to quite mixed reviews, due to how the monetization was handled regarding skins not carrying over. Now personally, I think that that's not really a good reason to hate a game, though I understand why people would for that reason. It's also like when people try to handwave things and say, oh, it's just the same game but a different engine, except the engine is completely different and improved, and it feels that way. God, I can't believe I'm actually holding water for Hi-rez, but the point being that Smite 2 wasn't bad, but it wasn't a smash hit that Hi-rez seemingly needed it to be, and maybe arguably wasn't the direct upgrade that they needed it to be to Smite 1. And with nearly all the other Hi-rez games severely slowing down at this point, largely due to the neglect for many years, Hi-rez was going to have to start making some big moves if they wanted to stay afloat as a private company. January 29th, 2025, and Hi-rez would drop more news that they would be planning on shrinking their content cycle even more for Paladins going forward. This was accompanying their update of Wakona's Wake. Worse, and seemingly coming without Evil Mojo Studios planning, the studio working on Paladins and Hi-rez would drop a bomb on everyone. February 2025. Hi-rez, seemingly, in a move of desperation, would put all of their eggs into the Smite 2 basket and lay off a whopping estimated 60 developers. Operations would be shifted largely to Smite 2, meaning that the other 3 games, Rogue Company, Realm Royale, and yes, Paladins, would have their development halted, and they would be shifted fully into maintenance mode. The thing being, a number of Smite devs were also let go, meaning that it wasn't just placing all of the eggs into one basket, it was getting rid of any of the excess ones that you felt like you didn't need to try to keep your company afloat. The thing being, a number of Smite 2 devs were also let go. That's not me excusing layoffs in game development, and I hope that everyone got on their feet and got the help they needed, but I'm simply explaining why Hi-rez would have to make these harsh decisions. While normally Todd Harris would respond to game-related stuff and Erez Goran, the other Hi-rez founder, the main one, would respond to like business stuff, Hi-rez now had a CEO, Stuart Chisholm. Stuart had actually been a part of Hi-rez for some time, helping both develop Tribes and Smite, but now, as fans were calling it, sort of accurately speaking business-wise, Stuart had become a mouthpiece for Hi-rez, and a bodyguard for criticism, like typical of a CEO for the founders of the company. Chisholm literally brags about being a leader in games as a service on his LinkedIn, and when receiving negative publicity for the layoffs of the following year, would delete his Twitter account altogether. Both of these things should tell you all you need to know about the guy. But sadly, hi-rez at the executive level has always been filled with these types, and it's a shame. I say it every hi-rez video, but hi-rez really has a potential as a studio to do so much more, and they've shown it with a consistent ability to make fun games. However, past making fun games, they never show an ability to properly maintain a game and have such a history of trend chasing to negative and poor results. While for many years, I would always try and observe hi-rez and their actions from a video game perspective and video game studio lens. My newest theory is just simpler. Occam's razor. I think the people in charge of the company found gaming as a place and realm to make money in, and with. I don't think they really have a loyalty to gaming in the same way that other indie or private studios might have. This would explain their desire to over-monetize all of their games and how they show little desire to keep development trucking when the going gets rough. They also have some of the worst PR I've ever seen from a company. I mean, the founders and CEO are all heavily disliked. Just read Reddit or Twitter comment sections for like 5 seconds and poof. I don't think hi-rez will ever learn from their lesson, and not at this point, with how stuck these grown men are in their ways. The only thing that we can hope for is the painless transition for those who work with them and were let go in the past few years. Their recent reception to the criticism regarding Smite 2 is another good example of this, or their non-response, as typical of hi-rez. The ironic thing is that they have tons of community managers working at the company from previous companies, it's just that one of them is, Daybreak. While Paladins is still technically trucking, its development has all been halted, and it's at a mere 3,300 players peak, 1,700 players concurrently. The only silver lining is a possible sequel, and well, that's not really a silver lining with how hi-rez just handled Smite's sequel. In fact, I might even have given Paladins players jump scares with that statement. Because how is it a silver lining to have your emotions tugged around with the promise of things being different this time, even if you have some fun with it? It's like being with an abusive partner, where sometimes things are good, so the good is supposed to outweigh the bad. That's what being a hi-rez supporter is like, or a gamer for their games. It was like an abusive relationship, where every time a new game would come out and you had fun, you felt like things were gonna be different this time. Well, things were never different, unless changes are made and put into practice. And if the core of something or someone is rotten and not willing to change, it takes a lot more than a few fancy moves to put that away or change that fact. If you buy a hi-rez game at this point, you're basically subjecting yourself to this treatment again and again, no matter how many new company names they come up with. This is accompanied by them having interest in just making your money, not forming a relationship with you and not servicing you properly. The music's playing fair, so detectives, let's get to cracking this mystery for good. The timeline has terminated and we have gathered more than enough clues to solve this case, and so, if you missed any along the way, why did Paladins get its development halted, and why did it fail to reach the heights of success that it could have? Well, hi-rez decision making, classic. Monetization pushes, loss of innovation and uniqueness, fierce competition, slow and infrequent update cycles, the hi-rez effect. If you've seen any of my other episodes regarding hi-rez, Global Agenda, one of my first episodes and my favorite games ever, hence my blood feud with hi-rez, and my Rogue Company episode, you know what the hi-rez effect is. It's their inability to manage a game and work through the game's balancing and lifecycle issues, all the while being consistently able to keep making fun games, even when they're called copycat games, like Paladins, which still managed to find success and develop a cult following. While this episode might have come across very negative, my negativity is pointed more so at the Shepherd. I actually think that Paladins was relatively successful, given all that it was given from hi-rez, and I enjoyed my time beta testing the game personally. I just can't help but think about what could have been. And that sounds strange for a game that became the Overwatch free-to-play clone, but I really think that Paladins could have set itself apart and been something more and something special, had hi-rez had more faith in it and less faith in just copying trends. Regardless, plenty of players found enjoyment in Paladins, whether through characters like Makoa and his ability to eat anything thrown at him as a tank, or Vatu the flanker and his high skill ceiling and powerful ult. Paladins might not have the best historical view in hindsight, but I think it's worth mentioning that it made plenty of players' days better, the free Overwatch clone or not. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you thought about Paladins in the comments below.